Good afternoon. My name is Katie Burrows. I'm a partner with PilieroMazza in our government contracts practice. And my colleague Eric Valle and I are here today to talk about the new sustainable procurement regulations that went into effect just in May. So thank you all for joining. Just as a heads up, for whatever reason, I think my name is appearing as Eric, but you'll certainly be able to tell the difference between our voices. So, so anyway, thank you for coming today. Just a little bit of background about myself. I lead the bid protest practice at PilieroMazza. And in addition to bid protests, I do handle, REAs, investigations, False Claims Act, key TAM suits. Also work on contract claims, including terminations for convenience and default, and then, your disputes between subs and primes. I also handle compliance issues as well. And then I often practice before the Court of Federal Claims, GAO, the Federal Circuit, and then various state and other federal agencies with regard to bid protests. And then I'm going to let Eric introduce himself.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Eric Valle. I am a government contracts attorney here at PilieroMazza. I, in my practice, handle the full spectrum of government contracts issues, including counseling clients on issues such as these new sustainable procurement regulations, bid protests, and claims and appeals and False Claims Act investigations. I think a lot of the areas of government contracts that we deal with, including protest claims and False Claims Act investigations, are implicated by some of the new regulations that come out, and there may be potential effects in each of those areas based on these new regulations. So we look forward to talking with you more about those issues today. I'll turn it back over to Katie for the next slide.
Thanks, Eric. So just a quick introduction about PilieroMazza. We are a full-service business law firm. We do lots of work with government contractors. We also do substantial amount of work with commercial businesses. And our practice areas include, construction, litigation, labor and employment, corporate M&A, and then our government contracts practice. And you can see on this slide the various areas, kind of sub-areas that we work within as well. All right, so today we're going to talk about what prompted these new sustainable procurement regulations, what changes have been made, meaning what updates to the regulations have been made to procure sustainable products and services, how the new rule affects government contractors, challenges and opportunities to contractors that are brought about by the new rule, and then just some final parting thoughts. Eric, I'm going to switch it back to you just to discuss a little bit of the background on sustainable procurement.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. So back in around 2011, there was an interim rule published in a FAR case concerning sustainable procurement. That rule essentially sat dormant for the next decade. And then on December 8th, 2021, President Biden signed Executive Order 14057, catalyzing clean energy industries and jobs through federal sustainability. Section 208A of that executive order directed agencies to reduce emissions, promote environmental stewardship, support resilient supply chains, and essentially incentivize markets for sustainable products and services by purchasing those sustainable products and services in accordance with certain statutory and regulatory requirements, as well as recommendations from the EPA. One of the president's overarching goals in kind of issuing this executive order was to achieve what is called net zero emissions within federal procurement by the year 2050. while increasing the sustainability of federal supply chains. And so pretty a lofty goal there, but the government felt and the executive branch felt that if federal procurement shifted more towards procuring sustainable products and services, that these policies could be implemented, and some of these goals, such as reducing emissions and promoting environmental stewardship, would be advanced in a significant way through the power of the federal government purchasing. Following the issuance of that executive order, and in particular the Section 208A of that executive order, the Council on Environmental Quality issued a memorandum. That memorandum is M-22-06 with some instructions and directions for how agencies could comply with the executive order. And then the CEQ, that Council on Environmental Quality, also issued various instructions as well to help guide federal agencies. And so with all of that guidance having been distributed in, earlier this year, the FAR Council proposed a new rule to implement these policies and implement these goals through various regulations, including most notably in revising FAR Part 23 to make FAR Part 23 a kind of cornerstone of sustainable procurement and a one-stop shop for the sustainable procurement regulations. Kayla, with that, we can go to the next slide.
Great.
So a little bit more background.
Oh, go ahead, Eric.
Thanks, Katie. On April 22nd, the FAR Council published this rule, which includes the changes to FAR Subpart 23.1 with a final effective date of May 22nd, 2024. So as of May 22nd, 2024, the new FAR Part 23 went into effect. All of the changes to that part went into effect, as well as changes to various corresponding sections of the FAR, including the definitions in FAR 2.101. The new FAR rules were created to amend the FAR to restructure and update this FAR Part 23 to focus on environmental and sustainability matters, to implement a requirement for agencies to procure these sustainable products and services to the maximum extent practicable, which is a term we'll discuss in a little more detail later on in this presentation, and to update various requirements for construction and architect engineer contracts, both of which are implicated in various ways by the changes to FAR Part 23. But as well, FAR Part 23 is more broadly applicable to most contracts, as we'll get into a little bit later in the presentation as well. And so with that background in mind, I'll kick it back over to Katie.
So to drill down a little bit further on the changes that have been made to the FAR as a result of the final rule, as set forth in the Federal Register, the final rule dedicates FAR Part 23, as Eric mentioned, to environmental matters by moving the prior regs relating to drug-free workplaces and contractors' ban on texting while driving. Those have been moved to FAR Part 26. It also adds a definition of sustainable products in FAR Part 2.101. It consolidates and updates the statutory and environmental purchasing program requirements, and those are in FAR Part 23.1, which we'll talk about more later. It also includes and creates a new contract clause to be included in solicitations at 52223-23. It's sustainable products and services, and that provides specifics for the solicitations that are at issue. It also dedicates FAR Part 23.2 to energy savings performance contracts, consolidates requirements related to hazardous and radioactive material in FAR Part 23.3, And then, let's see, consolidates and updates federal facility and pollution prevention requirements in FAR Part 23.4. And I apologize, you can switch to slide 9 now. And it redesignates the remaining content that was at FAR Part 23.8 to FAR Part 23.5, and that deals with greenhouse gas emissions. And then it makes some other changes throughout the FAR to align with the FAR Part 23 revisions. It updates agency requirements, as Eric mentioned, for construction A&E contracts at FAR 36104B1 to align with the CEQ's guiding principles for sustainable federal buildings and associated instructions. And then it removed certain contractor reporting requirements that were included in 52223-11 and 52223-12 and -5. And finally, it just finalizes the interim rule that had been previously published in 2011. I think it's notable 2 changes that were adopted in this final rule are that the rule will require the government to specify, and we'll talk about this, but specify which sustainable products and services are applicable to the acquisition, which is important. And this was changed from the proposed rule in the final rule to eliminate the need for small businesses to try to determine which purchasing programs apply to specific acquisition, and ensure that all offerors have access to that same information about what the government's requirements are. And then second, the rule requires compliance only with the EPA recommendations for specification standards and eco-label that were in effect as of October 2023. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Eric to discuss what actually is a sustainable procurement.
Thanks, Eddie. So the FAR defines sustainable acquisition in pretty lofty terms to mean acquiring products or services in order to create and maintain conditions under which humans and nature can exist in productive harmony, and that permit fulfilling the social, economic, and other requirements of present and future generations. Getting into practice of what that means, the FAR further includes a definition of what it means to be a sustainable product and service. And the FAR defines sustainable products and services to mean those products and services that are subject to and meet certain statutory mandates and directives for purchasing. The statutory mandates include products that are Energy Star certified, federal energy management program designated products, certain bio-based products that comply with the bio preferred program requirements, and there are others as well listed in the FAR. And then the required EPA purchasing programs that also constitute a sustainable product and or service include WaterSense labeled products and services and Safer Choice certified products and services. So as Katie mentioned before, the proposed rule that the FAR Council issued garnered some confusion from small businesses, especially as to, how would small businesses locate these products and or services? How would they source them? And what did it even mean necessarily to be a sustainable product and or service? And so importantly, in the final rule, as well as it implemented through the contract clause FAR 52-223-23, the government will actually have the burden here. They'll identify the sustainable products and services that a contractor is required to deliver in the statement of work or elsewhere in the solicitation or contract. So no longer will, as maybe contemplated by the initial proposed rule, no longer will contractors have to necessarily guess at what it is the government is actually trying to acquire in terms of a sustainable product or service. That being said, the contract that any contractor enters into that lists these sustainable products and services, contractors will have the obligation to actually provide those products and their services, and there can be consequences of not complying with those requirements. So if a product delivered under a contract is required to be Energy Star certified, contractors need to make sure that the product they're actually sourcing and delivering to the government is truly Energy Star certified, or else there are potential implications that not only range from breach of contract, but False Claims Act allegations and various other negative consequences that would flow from providing anything that's, not certified to the standards that the government is requesting that it be certified to. Kaylee, we can go to the next slide. So some of the effects of the new rule, the policies and procedures established by this new rule apply to, quote, all contract actions, including those using Part 12 procedures for commercial products and cost items and commercial services and acquisitions valued at or below the micro purchase threshold. Now, Katie will get into in a bit here the exceptions and exemptions that apply to this rule, but what we can see from this language is that at the outset, it is a broad rule that is going to apply to almost everything that the government purchases through a FAR-based contract. And there are no real exceptions at the outset for commercial products where you would typically see less stringent requirements in government purchasing, or those valued at or below the micro purchase threshold, where you're typically alleviated from more of the stringent requirements that the government imposes on other purchases. This is significant, not only in that you as contractors will be likely to experience and see these requirements pop up in your contracts as they are being competed and bid in the future, but also it's something to keep an eye out for if you're a contractor that deals regularly in providing sustainable products and services. If these requirements are not being solicited, if the government is not attempting to purchase sustainable products and services and not including these in a contract, you'd want to contact your attorney and discuss whether maybe an exception or an exemption applies. And if it doesn't, then there may be the opportunity to file a pre-award protest or seek clarification from the government as to why the government is not applying these new sustainable procurement policies and procedures to a particular contract action that it's endeavoring to enter into. With that, we can move to the next slide. And I'll pass it over to Katie. Oh, no, I'm sorry. I'm taking this one as well. So certain contracts are exempt from the requirement. Despite that broad language, the FAR lists various contracts that are exempt, but those exemptions are fairly narrow. So the first is for contracts performed or supplies delivered outside of the United States. There's a kind of further exception there for if the agency head determines that such application is in the interest of the United States, you may see that requirement pop up in a contract that is to be performed outside of the United States. But generally, those contracts performed outside of the U.S. will not be subject to these requirements. There are additional exceptions for contracts for weapons systems, contracts for energy-consuming products or systems designed or procured for combat, and contracts for bio-based products to be used in the military equipment. So you can see most of the exceptions go towards military functionality and or those contracts that are going to be outside of the United States. But outside of these four sort of limited exceptions or specific exemption that the FAR provides for that agencies can utilize on really a one-off basis, again, these new rules will apply to, quote, all contract actions. And if you're not seeing these policies and procedures being applied to a specific opportunity, a specific contract action that you're interested in pursuing, we would recommend then that you speak with your attorney to either identify whether there is an applicable exception or exemption, or whether this would be something that would be potentially protestable in a pre-award challenge. And now with that, I'll kick it over to the next slide and we can turn it back over to Katie.
Yeah, and just to comment, the exceptions are listed at 23.105, and there's also exemptions listed at 23.106. So for your references. Turning to slide 13, the effects of the new rule. So the rule requires agencies to procure sustainable products and services, as Eric identified and as defined in Part 2.101, to the maximum extent practicable. Per FAR Part 23.103, it is assumed that procuring sustainable products and or services is practicable unless the agency can't acquire those products or services competitively within a reasonable performance schedule that meet reasonable performance requirements or at a reasonable price. It's important to note that when considering whether the price of a sustainable product is reasonable, agencies should consider whether the product is cost effective over the life of the product. We can move on to the next slide. Per FAR 23.104, a requiring activity may submit a written justification to the CO stating that procuring sustainable products or services is not practicable based on one or more of the three criteria that we just discussed. And the written justification can be for a specific product or service or at the line item or contract level. So it can be, very specific. Moving on to slide 15, per FAR Part 23.109, solicitations and contracts that are subject to the new sustainable procurement rules are to contain, and Eric mentioned this earlier, FAR 52223-23, sustainable products and services, unless that written justification has been provided that it's not practicable to do so under FAR Part 23.104, or an exception under 23.105, or an exemption under 23.106 applies. Notably, FAR 52223-23 requires that sustainable products and services, including the purchasing program and type of product or service that are applicable to this contract or the contract, and any products or services that are not subject to the clause will be set forth in the statement of work or elsewhere in the contract. So that's very important. As we talked about earlier, it does put the onus on the government to identify the products and services. With that, Eric, I will turn it back to you.
Yeah, so just a quick comment on that language, to the maximum extent practicable. Katie and I's practice deals a lot in bid protests. There was a fairly significant bid protest decision several years ago in a case called Palantir that interpreted very similar language in the commercial products and services regulations that came out, that the government would acquire commercial products and services to the maximum extent practicable. In the decision that we're talking about and Palantir, there was a challenge pre-award that the solicitation, that there were commercial products and services available, and the government was seeking to acquire a development of a new product. And that protest was a successful challenge that the government should go back and reconsider the commercial products and services that are available and seek to acquire those to the extent practicable. And so the inclusion of that language in this regulation kind of harkens protest attorneys back to that decision. And that's why we say if you are a contractor and you are aware of certain sustainable products and services, but the government is not seeking to acquire those products or services, there are potential protest grounds that could be raised to, make the government go back and either seek to acquire those products and services or better justify why the acquisition of those products and services would not be practicable under the circumstances. So that's just an important inclusion of a couple of words there in the regulations that we as attorneys see, and just opens up that opportunity. And it could be an important business development opportunity for contractors seeking to go after certain opportunities and better position themselves to win. So, moving on the topic at hand here, in addition, the FAR clause, the sort of implementing clause that will go into solicitations and contracts, requires contractors to ensure that sustainable products and services required by their contract are actually delivered to the government, furnished for use by the government, incorporated into the construction of a building or public work, if that's applicable, and furnished for use in performing services under the contract where the cost of products is a direct cost to the contract. So again, this clause not only puts the onus on the government previously to actually list and identify the sustainable products and services it's seeking to acquire, but it includes a requirement for contractors to then actually provide those products or services to the government. And again, the regulation, the rule that was finally put into place eliminated that confusion for potential contractors of, well, what actually is the government seeking to acquire here in terms of a sustainable product or service, by making the government identify those, but that the government or the contractor will still be, liable through the contract as well as through various False Claims Act angles to actually go out and source and deliver a product that meets these requirements in the statement of work. And so we can't stress enough that in going to figure out, yes, you can promise to deliver for example, Energy Star certified product, but in going to source those products, you should pay extra attention to and be particularly diligent that the certification on those products is that they are actually Energy Star certified, that the certification is correct, and that you're providing exactly what the government is seeking to acquire in the performance of the contract. And with that, we can move to the next slide. So again, the FAR clause that will be in future solicitations and contracts kind of just emphasizes this point again, stating that these sustainable products and services must meet the applicable standards, specifications, or other program requirements at the time of the quote or offer submission, and that they also must meet the EPA recommendations in effect as of October 2023. So the point of including this language was to give contractors a bit of clarity in the requirements that they would be required to comply with in the performance of the contract, and to make it such that if there is a change in requirements, that you're not having to constantly go back to your supply chain and update the sourcing of products that you're seeking to acquire, or really comply with a variable set of requirements here. There is a specific point in time by which compliance will be measured, and that point in time is at the time you submit that quote or offer, as well as what is in effect in these EPA recommendations as of October 2023. So there's not, once you enter into the contract, maybe not a a requirement to keep on your due diligence of, well, have there been any updates to these specifications since we submitted the quote? Have there been any updates to the EPA recommendations? The regulations make plain in this regard that there is a specific point in time that we're going to measure compliance by, and that compliance timeline is measured right there in the regulations you see on the screen. So with that, I will turn it back over to Katie.
Discussing what are sustainable products and services, if you go to FAR 2-101.101, which is the definitions section in the FAR, there is a new definition for sustainable products and services. It outlines that term means products and services that are subject to and meet certain statutory mandates and directives for purchasing. Those the first is our statutory purchasing programs, and those are identified as products containing recovered material that is designated by the EPA under the comprehensive procurement guidelines. And you can, if you go to 2.101 of the FAR, it has a link there so that you can see what those guidelines are. It also identifies energy and water efficient products that are Energy Star certified or Federal Energy Management Program designated products. Again, the link to those is also in 2.101, so there's an ease of reference there. The third statutory purchasing program is bio-based products that meet the content requirements of the USDA under the Bio Preferred program. Again, there's a link in 2.101 to the Bio Preferred program. And then last statutory purchasing program is the acceptable chemicals, products, and manufacturing processes that are listed under the EPA's Significant New Alternatives Policy. It's called the SNAP program. And that too is also, there's a link to that as well. Then in addition to those 4 statutory purchasing programs, there are also, and you can move to the next slide here, required EPA purchasing programs that are identified in FAR 2.101. There are 3 of those. The first is the WaterSense labeled products and services. There's a link to that. The Safer Choice certified products, which contain safer chemical ingredients. There's a link to that. And then products that meet the EPA recommendations of specification standards and eco-labels that are in effect as of October 2023. And there is also a link to that, recommendations and specifications. Moving on to slide 20, as I mentioned, that FAR 2.101 does link to those websites, so there's an ease of reference for contractors to just click on those links and see what complies or what's listed as an Energy Star certified product, for instance. And I think with that, Eric, I can pass it back to you to talk about potential challenges.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Katie. So, anytime there is a new set of regulations, there are going to be positives and negatives with the set of regulations that come out. The comments actually on the proposed rule were, I would say, for the most part, fairly positive, and where negative, just attempting to clear up areas that were potentially ambiguous in the new rule. But certainly this new set of requirements will come with challenges to contractors, including increased costs to implement sustainability measures to, increase compliance in the supply chain as well as within the company itself. Certain supply chain disruptions as agencies shift to procuring more sustainable products and services to the maximum extent practicable. There could potentially be a strain or a stress on the supply chain that might cause delays in delivering, for example, Energy Star certified products. as well as, for small businesses in particular, there may be higher relative compliance costs compared to larger businesses that have been already shifting towards these efforts or are able to capitalize on, certain economies of scale that large businesses may have. All of these are certainly costs that are going to impact your business as you go to compete for these contracts as they arise. But as attorneys, I think we always say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound down the road here. And so making sure that your company complies with these requirements as they arise, or even in advance of these contracts being solicited and potentially being awarded to your company, is really going to pay dividends down the road. If there's a lack of compliance, that can always lead to increased costs, litigation, investigations, harm to reputation, et cetera, including potentially terminations for default, which could just impact your ability to obtain awards for a long time into the future. And so with that, we can move to the next slide. Like I said, all of those are potential challenges that come with the new regulations, but in addition to those potential challenges, the new set of regulations, I think, raises a lot of potential opportunities. Access to new markets for sustainable products and services, long-term investment in sustainable products and services, delivering long-term cost savings, as well as just new business opportunities as these various government agencies solicit contracts and have to acquire, to the maximum extent practical, sustainable products and services. If you are a company that has access to these sustainable products and services, can provide them, and is particularly, well-versed in this area, I think there's a lot of potential opportunity as agencies go and seek to acquire new products and services that they may not be as aware of these regulations. They may not be looking at things through the same lens that you do. And there's a way to shape potentially the terms of the solicitation to benefit your company, to get agencies to just comply with their regulatory obligations. And so, yes, this places a burden on contractors. There is a way to, capitalize on these new requirements and certainly gain some market share for various businesses out there. And with that, I will pass it back over to Katie.
Some final thoughts here. When moving forward, you should be proactive in checking, as Eric has mentioned throughout, whether the products and services that you are offering are, actually qualify as sustainable. If you advertise your products or services as sustainable, make sure that they align with the relevant EPA or USDA standards. And also, you should review the GSA's Green Procurement Compilation website, which, that website helps users identify applicable green purchasing requirements for products and services. You'll see that it provides information on, various products, appliances, building finishes, furnishings, cafeteria products, cleaning products, construction materials. It also, that's to name a few. As far as services, it identifies cafeteria and food services, custodial services, electronic equipment leasing, laundry services, landscaping services. And if you click on those various tabs, you'll be able to find, what an overview and what are required green products versus optional green practices, and so on. It will give you a good overview for each of those, various products and services that are being procured by the federal government. And I think that is it. That is all we have. So we'll be able to leave you a little early today. Obviously, this is a really new you know, regulation. So there'll certainly be, it'll be interesting to watch the case law, and for Eric and I, the bid protest case law, to see how some of this stuff is borne out and shaped going forward. So I'm sure we'll have more to say as this progresses and is implemented. Eric, anything else you want to add?
Oh, we appreciate your time today. And if you have any questions, I don't see any in the chat box, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Katie or I, and we will be happy to answer the questions that you have.
Great. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.